At the hotel, no one understood the Frenchwoman until the caretaker's 7-year-old daughter spoke French, and what the woman did surprised everyone. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The autumn rain pelted against the windows of the Grand Vista Hotel as Marguerite Dubois stood at the marble reception desk, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she clutched a worn leather purse. At 73, she had travelled across an ocean with nothing but hope and a faded photograph tucked safely in her coat pocket. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but I need to understand what you're trying to tell me," Robert Thompson, the hotel manager, said with growing frustration. His kind eyes showed genuine concern, but after 20 minutes of gesturing and broken English attempts, both he and the elegant Frenchwoman were at their breaking point. Marguerite's silver hair, once perfectly styled in Paris, now hung limp from the October drizzle. She pointed repeatedly at the photograph, then at herself, then toward the elevator, speaking rapidly in French. "S'il vous plaît, je dois trouver. I must find." Her voice cracked with exhaustion and desperation. Other guests in the ornate lobby began to stare. Eleanor Hayes, an 80-year-old regular who spent her winters at the hotel, shook her head sympathetically. "Poor dear, looks like she's been traveling for days," she whispered to her companion. "Look, ma'am," Robert tried again, his voice gentle but strained. "Maybe you should call someone who can translate. Do you have family in America?" He mimed, holding a phone to his ear. Marguerite's eyes filled with tears of frustration. She had come so far, spent her life savings on this journey, and now she couldn't even explain why she was here. She fumbled in her purse, pulling out more photographs, old ones, some in black and white, others faded with age. That's when 7-year-old Sophie Martinez appeared from behind the maintenance closet where her father Carlos worked as the night janitor. Sophie had been coloring quietly in the back office, but the commotion had drawn her curious attention. She was a bright child with dark curls and eyes that held wisdom beyond her years, the kind of child who noticed everything and forgot nothing. Sophie approached the desk cautiously, her small sneakers squeaking slightly on the polished floor. She looked up at the distressed woman, then at Mr. Thompson, then back at Marguerite. "Excusez-moi, madame," Sophie said in perfect French, her small voice cutting through the tension like a bell. "Puis-je vous aider?" The lobby fell completely silent. Marguerite's eyes widened in shock and relief. She dropped to her knees to be at Sophie's eye level, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, mon Dieu, tu parles français. Yes, yes, please help me, little angel." Robert stared in amazement. "Sophie, how do you—" "My mama taught me before she died," Sophie said simply, switching back to English. "She was from Quebec." She turned back to Marguerite and continued in French. "What do you need, madame?" For the next several minutes, Sophie listened intently as Marguerite poured out her story in rapid French, occasionally nodding and asking gentle questions. The adults watched in fascination as the little girl's expression grew more serious, more concerned. Finally, Sophie turned to Robert, her small face grave with the weight of what she'd learned. "Mr. Thompson," she said slowly, "the lady's name is Marguerite. She came from France to find someone very important, someone she lost a long, long time ago." Sophie paused, glancing back at Marguerite, who was watching her with desperate hope. "She says she thinks they might be here, in this hotel." The words hung in the air like a challenge to everything they thought they knew about their quiet little establishment. Marguerite reached into her purse one more time and pulled out a piece of paper, old and yellowed with age. Sophie's eyes grew wide as she read it. "What is it, Sophie?" Robert asked, leaning forward. The little girl looked up at him, then at her father Carlos, who had emerged from the maintenance area, then back at the paper in her small hands. It's a birth certificate," she whispered. "And the name on it." She stopped, looking around the lobby at all the faces staring at her, waiting. "The name on it is someone who lives here. Sophie's small fingers traced the faded ink on the birth certificate as every adult in the lobby held their breath. Her dark eyes moved slowly across the yellowed paper, and when she looked up, her voice was barely a whisper. "Eleanor Hayes," she said, glancing toward the elderly woman sitting in the velvet armchair. "Born October 15th, 1944, in New Orleans, Louisiana." Eleanor's teacup crashed to the marble floor, shattering into a dozen pieces. The sound echoed through the sudden silence like a gunshot. Her face went chalk white, and her hands began to shake uncontrollably. "That's impossible," Eleanor gasped, gripping the arms of her chair. "That's absolutely impossible." Marguerite rose slowly from her knees, her eyes locked on Eleanor's face with an intensity that made everyone else fade into the background. She spoke rapidly in French to Sophie, never taking her gaze off the trembling woman. Sophie translated, her voice growing stronger. "She says she's been looking for you for 79 years. She says she never forgot your face, even as a baby." "No!" Eleanor shook her head violently. "You don't understand. My parents died when I was an infant. I was raised by my aunt in Boston. There was no one else. No one in France. No French connection. Nothing." But Marguerite was already moving across the lobby, her steps sure and determined despite her age. She reached into her coat and pulled out another photograph. This one, older than the rest, nearly crumbling at the edges. Robert stepped forward, his hotel manager instincts taking over. "Ladies, perhaps we should move this conversation somewhere more private." "No!" Eleanor's voice cracked like a whip. "I want to see what she has, right here, right now." Marguerite handed the photograph to Sophie, who looked at it and gasped. Without a word, she walked to Eleanor and placed it gently in her shaking hands. The photograph showed two young women, perhaps in their early 20s, standing outside what looked like a small French cafe. One had dark hair and striking features, unmistakably a younger version of Marguerite. The other was blonde with delicate features and eyes that, even in the faded photograph, were identical to Eleanor's. "The blonde woman," Sophie translated as Marguerite spoke, "she was your mother. Her name was Catherine, and she was Marguerite's best friend." Eleanor stared at the photograph, and for a moment her entire world tilted on its axis. Everything she thought she knew about her life, her history, her identity, began to crumble like ancient paper. "But why?" Eleanor's voice broke. "Why are you here now? Why after all these years?" Marguerite spoke again, and Sophie's translation sent chills through everyone present. "Because she promised Catherine she would find you, and because Catherine left something for you in France, something she's been protecting for 79 years. The lobby clock chimed 9 o'clock, its deep tone marking not just the hour, but the moment when Eleanor Hayes's entire life story was about to change forever. Eleanor sat in the hotel's private lounge, the photograph clutched in her hands as if it might disappear at any moment. Marguerite sat across from her, with Sophie perched on a small stool between them, serving as their bridge between two worlds and two languages. "Tell me about my mother," Eleanor whispered, her voice hoarse with emotion. "Tell me everything." Marguerite's weathered hands folded in her lap as she began to speak, pausing frequently for Sophie to translate. The little girl's voice took on an almost storytelling quality as she relayed Marguerite's words. "Catherine was the most beautiful person I ever knew," Sophie translated. "Not just on the outside, but her heart was pure gold. We worked together at a small bookshop in Lyon during the war. She was so smart, Eleanor. She spoke 4 languages and could solve any problem." Eleanor's eyes never left Marguerite's face as the story unfolded. "She fell in love with an American soldier, your father. His name was James Hayes, and he was stationed in France in 1943. They married in secret because his commanding officer didn't approve of soldiers marrying French girls." The pieces of Eleanor's life began shifting like a kaleidoscope. But I was told my parents died in a car accident when I was 6 months old. Marguerite shook her head sadly, speaking more urgently now. Sophie's translation grew more emotional. That's not what happened. When Catherine became pregnant with you, James was transferred back to America. He promised to send for her, to bring both of you home to Boston. What went wrong? Eleanor asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know. Everything, Sophie said, her small voice carrying the weight of Marguerite's memories. James's family had money, influence. When he got back to America, they convinced him that Catherine was just trying to trap him. They told him French women couldn't be trusted, that the baby might not even be his. Eleanor's heart clenched. So he abandoned us? No, Sophie said quickly, translating Marguerite's emphatic response. He sent letters, money, promises that he was working on bringing you both over. But his family intercepted everything. Catherine never received a single letter after he left France. The room fell silent, except for the gentle tick of an antique clock on the mantel. Eleanor tried to process this revelation, this complete rewriting of everything she believed about her origins. How do you know all this? She asked. Marguerite reached into her purse and pulled out a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. She handed them to Eleanor, speaking softly. Sophie translated. After Catherine died from pneumonia when you were 8 months old, a lawyer came to collect you. He said your father's family in America had arranged for adoption. Catherine was so sick she could barely speak, but she made me promise to keep these letters. They arrived after she died, 43 letters from your father, plus money and legal papers to bring you both to America. Eleanor's hands shook as she untied the ribbon. The letters were addressed to "My dearest Catherine and baby Eleanor" in bold handwriting. The postmark showed they were sent over nearly 2 years. He never stopped writing, Sophie continued translating. He never stopped trying to find you. But by the time his letters finally reached Lyon, you were already gone to America, and Catherine was buried in the village cemetery. Eleanor looked up, tears streaming down her face. Then why didn't he find me in America? Why didn't he contact my aunt? Marguerite's next words, translated by Sophie, sent ice through Eleanor's veins. Because the lawyer who took you wasn't sent by your father's family. He was sent by someone else entirely. Someone who wanted to make sure you and your father never found each other. The implications hung in the air like storm clouds. Eleanor's entire life, her identity, her family history, even her name, might have been built on a lie. And somewhere in America, if he was still alive, was a father who had spent 79 years wondering what happened to his French bride and baby daughter. Carlos Martinez emerged from the shadows where he'd been quietly listening, his janitor's uniform somehow making him appear more trustworthy rather than less. His weathered face showed the same intelligent intensity that sparkled in his daughter's eyes. "Excuse me," he said softly, his slight accent adding warmth to his words. "I couldn't help but overhear. This lawyer who took Eleanor, did he leave any records, any papers?" Marguerite nodded eagerly and spoke to Sophie in French. The little girl's face grew serious as she translated. "She says yes. Catherine's neighbor kept some documents. The lawyer gave a receipt, and there was a business card. Marguerite still has copies." Robert Thompson, who had been standing quietly by the door, stepped forward. "I think I need to call the police. This sounds like it could be fraud, maybe even kidnapping." "No!" Eleanor said sharply, surprising herself with her vehemence. "Not yet. I need to understand what happened first. If this gets into the legal system now, it could take years to sort out, and She paused, the weight of her 79 years suddenly feeling heavier. "Time isn't something I have in abundance." Carlos nodded respectfully. "My wife, before she passed, she worked at the courthouse in Miami. She taught me things about finding old records, tracing paperwork. If you'd like, I could make some calls tomorrow, see what I can discover about this lawyer." Sophie tugged on her father's sleeve. and whispered something in Spanish. Carlos smiled and nodded. "Sophie reminds me," he said. "Her mother also taught her some computer skills. She can help search online databases for James Hayes. If he's still alive, if he has family, we might be able to find them." Eleanor looked around the room at these strangers, who had suddenly become her allies in solving a mystery she didn't even know existed an hour ago. "Why are you all helping me? You don't even know me." "Actually," Robert said gently, "I've known you for 12 years, Mrs. Hayes. You spend 3 months here every winter. You tip generously, you're kind to the staff, and you always remember everyone's names. That counts for something." Carlos nodded. "Besides, my Sophie has good instincts about people. If she's willing to translate, then this lady," he gestured toward Marguerite, "is someone worth helping." Marguerite spoke again, and this time she didn't wait for Sophie to translate. In halting but determined English, she said, "Eleanor, I made promise to your mama. I keep promise 79 years. I not stop now." The emotion in her broken English was more powerful than any fluent speech could have been. Eleanor wiped her eyes and squared her shoulders in a gesture that would have been immediately recognizable to anyone who had known Catherine. "All right then. Where do we start?" Sophie pulled out a small notebook from her backpack, the kind elementary school children use for homework. With the seriousness of a seasoned detective, she opened to a blank page. "First," she said, "we make a list of everything we know. Then we make a list of everything we need to find out." As she began writing in her careful second-grade handwriting, Eleanor realized that this 7-year-old child might be the key to unlocking a mystery that had shaped her entire life. But what none of them knew yet was that the fake lawyer who had orchestrated Eleanor's adoption was part of a much larger scheme. And that scheme had left traces that could still be found, even after nearly 8 decades. The question was, would those traces lead to answers or to more dangerous secrets that someone had killed to protect? Sophie sat cross-legged on the hotel lounge floor, Robert's laptop balanced on her small legs, her fingers moving across the keyboard with surprising confidence. The adults had arranged themselves in a circle around her like she was their tiny general planning a campaign. "I found 17 James Hayes, who would be the right age," she announced, peering at the screen through her father's reading glasses, which were comically large on her small face. "But we need more information to know which one is the right one." Marguerite fumbled in her purse and produced another document, this one more recent than the others. She spoke rapidly in French, gesturing at the paper. "She says this is a letter from the Red Cross," Sophie translated after scanning the document. "She contacted them 20 years ago trying to find James Hayes. They found some information, but it was incomplete." Eleanor leaned forward. "What kind of information?" Sophie read carefully, translating as she went. "James Theodore Hayes, born January 12, 1922, in Boston, Massachusetts. Parents, Theodore Hayes and Martha Cromwell Hayes. Family business, Hayes Import Company. Military service, Army, stationed in France, 1943-1944. "That's him," Eleanor whispered. "That has to be him. The dates match perfectly." Carlos had been quietly taking notes in the margin of an old newspaper. Hayes Import Company. That should be easy to trace. Business licenses, tax records, newspaper archives. Companies that usually left paper trails. "Got it!" Sophie suddenly exclaimed, causing everyone to jump. Hayes Import Company was bought by Cromwell Industries in 1967. And look, she turned the laptop screen so the adults could see. "Cromwell Industries still exists. They have a website and everything." Robert read over her shoulder. "Founded in 1923 by Theodore Cromwell." Wait a minute. He frowned. "Marguerite said James's mother was Martha Cromwell Hayes, right?" Eleanor felt her heart skip. "So the Cromwell family took over James's family business? That seems suspicious," Carlos finished. "Very suspicious." Sophie was already typing again. Her small face scrunched in concentration. After several minutes, she looked up with wide eyes. "I found something really weird. Look at this obituary from 1945. She read from the screen. James Theodore Hayes, aged 23, died tragically in a car accident on December 8, 1945. Survived by his parents and sister. Services private. In lieu of flowers, donations may be made to the Cromwell Foundation." The room went completely silent. "But that's impossible," Eleanor said slowly. "If James died in 1945, then who was sending letters to my mother until 1946? Marguerite grabbed one of the letters from the bundle and pointed at the postmark. Sophie examined it carefully and nodded. "This letter is dated March 15, 1946, 4 months after James supposedly died." Carlos stood up and began pacing, his janitor's observational skills kicking into high gear. "So either James Hayes didn't die in that car accident, or someone else was writing those letters pretending to be him." "But why?" Eleanor asked. "Why would someone pretend to be a dead man writing to a French woman he'd never met?" Sophie had gone back to typing, and suddenly she gasped. "Oh no, oh no, no, no." "What is it, Mika?" Carlos asked, using the Spanish endearment. Sophie's voice was small and frightened. "I found another article. From the Boston Herald, January 3, 1946. Hayes family fortune missing. Investigation continues into disappearance of $2.3 million from Hayes Import Company. James Hayes, sole heir, died before allegations could be investigated." The pieces were starting to form a picture, and it wasn't pretty. "Someone killed James to steal his inheritance," Robert said quietly, "and then used his identity to string your mother along, making her think he was still alive and coming for her." Eleanor felt sick. But why keep writing to her? Why not just let her think he'd abandoned her? Marguerite spoke urgently in French, and Sophie's translation chilled everyone in the room, because Catherine had something they wanted. Something valuable that James had given her before he left France. Something worth enough to orchestrate an elaborate deception for 2 years. Eleanor looked at the photographs, the letters, the documents spread around them like pieces of a puzzle that was finally starting to make sense. "What did my mother have?" she asked. "What was so important that they'd go to all this trouble?" But before Marguerite could answer, Sophie's laptop chimed with an incoming email notification. She glanced at the screen, and her face went pale. Guys," she said in a small voice, "I think we have a problem. Someone just sent an email to the hotel's main account, and it's about us." Robert took the laptop from Sophie, his face growing more concerned as he read. His voice was steady but grim as he shared the message. "Mrs. Hayes, we understand you're conducting research into your family history. Some matters are better left undisturbed. For your safety and the safety of those helping you, please discontinue this investigation immediately." The email was signed simply, "Friends of the Family." Carlos immediately moved to the window and discreetly checked the parking lot. "How did they know we were investigating? We've only been at this for a few hours." "And how did they know to contact the hotel specifically?" Eleanor added, her voice tight with concern. Sophie had been unusually quiet, but now she tugged on her father's sleeve. "Papa, remember when Mama used to work late at the courthouse? She taught me about computer traces. Someone could be watching if we searched for certain names online." Marguerite spoke rapidly in French, her weathered hands shaking slightly. Sophie listened intently before translating. "She says this isn't the first time. 20 years ago, when she contacted the Red Cross, someone approached her in Lyon. A man in an expensive suit who told her that some American families prefer their privacy. He offered her money to stop looking." "What did she do?" Robert asked. "She took the money," Sophie translated, and then quickly added Marguerite's continued explanation. "But only because she was poor and sick, and she thought she could use it to come to America someday to find Eleanor herself. She never stopped keeping the letters and documents safe. Eleanor stood up and walked to the window, her mind racing. So for 79 years, someone has been actively preventing my father and me from finding each other. Someone with enough money and influence to monitor international searches, to pay people off, to send threatening emails. The Cromwell family, Carlos said quietly. It has to be. They inherited James's business, probably his money too, if Eleanor is his legitimate daughter. Then she has a claim to his estate, Robert finished. Even after all these years, if fraud was involved, there might be legal remedies. Sophie had been typing again, but more carefully this time. I'm using a different computer account, she explained. One they can't trace back to the hotel. And I found something really important. She turned the screen toward them. Martha Cromwell Hayes, James's mother. She didn't die until 1987. And according to her obituary, she spent her final years at a private nursing home, suffering from dementia. But look at this part, Sophie read slowly. In her final months, Mrs. Hayes often spoke of her regret about the French girl and the baby, and frequently asked staff to help her make things right. Eleanor sank back into her chair. She knew, James's own mother knew what her family had done, and it haunted her until she died. Marguerite spoke again, more urgently now, and pulled yet another item from her seemingly bottomless purse, this time a small wooden box, ornately carved. She says Catherine gave her this the day before she died, Sophie translated. She made her promise to only open it when she found you, Eleanor. She said it contains the truth about why the Cromwell family wanted you to disappear. Eleanor's hands trembled as she reached for the box. It was heavier than it looked, and there was a small brass lock that had tarnished with age. The key, Sophie continued translating. Catherine hid the key in the most obvious place. She said Americans always overlook the obvious. Eleanor examined the box, running her fingers along its carved edges. Then, almost by instinct, she flipped it over. Taped to the bottom, wrapped in what looked like wax paper, was a tiny brass key. As she prepared to unlock a secret that had been hidden for nearly 8 decades, Sophie's laptop chimed again. Another email. This time the message was shorter and far more direct. We know where you are. Stop now or face the consequences. Eleanor looked around at the faces of these people who had become her unlikely allies. A French woman who'd kept a 79-year promise, a hotel manager who cared about his guests, a janitor with a researcher's instincts, and a 7-year-old girl who spoke the language of truth. Whatever's in this box, she said firmly, it's worth more than their threats. Open it. As Eleanor turned the key in the lock, none of them noticed the black sedan that had just pulled into the hotel parking lot, or the 2 figures in dark coats who stepped out into the rain. The brass lock clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo through decades. Eleanor's hands trembled as she lifted the lid of the wooden box, revealing contents that made everyone lean forward in anticipation. Inside lay a folded document, a small silver locket and something wrapped in yellowed tissue paper. But it was the photograph lying on top that made Eleanor gasp and nearly drop the box. The black and white image showed James Hayes in his military uniform, but he wasn't alone. Standing beside him was another soldier, and the resemblance between them was unmistakable. They could have been twins. Sophie, Eleanor whispered, ask Marguerite if she's ever seen this other man before. The little girl studied the photograph and spoke rapidly in French with Marguerite. The elderly woman's response made Sophie's eyes widen. She says yes, this other man came to the bookshop once with James. His name was Thomas Cromwell, James's cousin. Carlos had moved to the window again and now turned back with urgency in his voice. We have visitors. 2 men in dark coats just entered the lobby. They're talking to the night desk clerk. Robert immediately moved to the door and turned the lock. There's another way out through the service corridor, but first we need to see what else is in that box. Eleanor unfolded the document with shaking hands. It was a letter, written in Catherine's delicate handwriting, dated just days before her death. "My dearest Eleanor," she read aloud, "if you are reading this, then Marguerite has kept her promise and found you. What I must tell you will be difficult, but you deserve the truth." A soft knock interrupted her. Then Robert's radio crackled, the front desk alerting him that two men were asking about their French guest and whether any other visitors had been asking questions about genealogy research. "Keep reading," Carlos whispered urgently. Eleanor continued. "The man you believe was your father, James Hayes, died in France 3 months after you were born. I was there. I held his hand as he died from injuries sustained in an ambush. But before he died, he told me something that changed everything." Sophie grabbed her father's hand, her father's. Even at 7, she understood they were uncovering something momentous. James had discovered that his cousin Thomas had been stealing from the family business for years. More than that, Thomas had been working with German agents, selling information about Allied movements. James had proof, and he was planning to expose Thomas when he returned to America. The knocking at the door became more insistent. Robert spoke quietly into his radio. "Tell them our guest retired for the evening, and we can't disturb her. If they'd like to leave a message, they can contact us in the morning." Eleanor's voice grew stronger as she continued reading. "Thomas somehow learned of James's plans. The ambush that killed your father was no accident. It was arranged by Thomas to protect his secrets. But James was clever. Before he died, he gave me something that Thomas would kill for." She reached into the box and unwrapped the tissue paper, revealing a small brass cylinder about the size of her thumb. Inside this cylinder are photographs of documents proving Thomas's treachery, along with bank records showing where he hid the stolen money. "James made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would get this evidence to his father in America." Marguerite spoke urgently in French, and Sophie translated. "She says Catherine tried to send letters to James's father, but they all came back unopened. Someone was intercepting all mail from France to the Hayes family." So Thomas took over the family identity, Carlos realized. He probably told everyone that James was a hero who died in service, while secretly he was the one who had him killed. Eleanor continued reading the letter. "By the time you read this, my precious daughter, Thomas Cromwell will have lived an entire lifetime with your father's money, your father's reputation, and your father's inheritance. The cylinder contains enough evidence to expose him and reclaim what is rightfully yours." The letter ended with words that brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. "You are the daughter of a hero, Eleanor. Your father died trying to do the right thing. Now it's your turn to finish what he started. I love you always. Mama." The knocking had stopped, but now they could hear footsteps in the corridor outside. Sophie had opened the silver locket and found a tiny photograph of James Hayes holding a baby. "This is you," she whispered to Eleanor. "This is you and your real daddy." Eleanor looked around at her unlikely team of allies. The janitor, the hotel manager, the French woman, and the brilliant little girl who had made all of this possible. "They've waited 79 years to bury this secret," she said firmly, "but I'm not letting them wait any longer." As if summoned by her words, Robert's radio crackled again. "Mr. Thompson, the two gentlemen are insisting they need to speak with you immediately. They say it's a matter of family urgency regarding Mrs. Hayes." Outside in the corridor, they could now hear voices, and one of them was saying, "We know they're in there. This needs to end tonight." Robert held up his hand for silence and whispered, "Service corridor now. Carlos knows the way." But Eleanor shook her head firmly. "No, I'm 79 years old. I'm tired of running from shadows. If they want to talk, we'll talk. Eleanor, you don't understand, Robert began. I understand perfectly, she interrupted, standing with a dignity that reminded everyone of her royal French lineage. These people have controlled my life story for 8 decades. They've kept me from knowing my father, stolen my inheritance, and threatened people who are just trying to help me. Enough. Marguerite spoke rapidly in French, and Sophie translated, "She agrees with Eleanor. She says Catherine would want us to be brave." Carlos looked at his daughter with concern. "Sophie, maybe you should go back to the staff room." "No, Papa," Sophie said with remarkable composure for a 7-year-old. "I'm the only one who can translate for Marguerite. She needs me." Eleanor walked to the door and opened it before anyone could stop her. Standing in the hallway were 2 men in expensive dark coats. One was elderly, probably in his 80s, with silver hair and cold blue eyes. The other was younger, perhaps 50, with the same sharp features. "Mrs. Hayes," the older man said with a voice like ice. "I'm Thomas Cromwell, Jr., and this is my son, Thomas III. I believe you have something that belongs to our family." Eleanor studied his face and saw no resemblance to the kind eyes of James Hayes in the photographs. "I don't believe we've met, Mr. Cromwell, though I suspect your father and I should have met many years ago." Thomas Jr.'s smile was cold. "My father is dead, Mrs. Hayes. He died peacefully in 1978, having lived an exemplary life as a war hero and successful businessman. I'd hate for anyone to tarnish his legacy with wild stories and forged documents." "Forged?" Eleanor stepped back and gestured for the men to enter the room. If they were going to have this confrontation, it would be on her terms, with witnesses. Thomas Jr.'s eyes immediately went to the opened wooden box on the table. "Ah, I see you've found Catherine Dubois' little treasure chest. We've been looking for that for a very long time." "How did you know about the box?" Robert asked suspiciously. Thomas III spoke for the first time. "We've had people monitoring Miss Dubois for decades. Every time she tried to contact the Red Cross, every genealogy search, every inquiry, we knew she'd eventually make her way to America." Marguerite spoke angrily in French, and Sophie started to translate, but Thomas Jr. held up his hand. "I speak French fluently, little girl. Madame Dubois just called me several very unpleasant names." He turned to Marguerite and continued in perfect French. "You should have taken the money we offered you in Lyon and disappeared." Eleanor felt a chill of realization. "You speak French. Your father spoke French. He knew exactly what he was doing when he had those fake letters written to my mother. My father was protecting his family's interests," Thomas Jr. said smoothly. "James Hayes was a traitor who was selling information to the Germans. When he died, my father stepped in to save the family business and honor." "That's a lie!" Eleanor's voice rang out with surprising strength. "I have the proof right here." She reached for the brass cylinder, but Thomas III moved faster than anyone expected. He lunged forward and grabbed the cylinder, but Carlos was ready for him. The 2 men grappled and the cylinder flew across the room, rolling under a heavy armoire. Sophie immediately scrambled after it, her small size allowing her to squeeze into the narrow space. "Sophie, be careful," Carlos called out as he wrestled with Thomas III. Thomas Jr. watched the chaos with cold calculation. "This is exactly why we preferred the quiet approach," he said to Eleanor. "Now you've involved innocent people, including a child." "You're the one who involved the child," Eleanor snapped back, "by lying for 79 years, by stealing my father's identity and his money." Sophie emerged from under the armoire, triumphantly holding the brass cylinder, but Thomas Jr. was already reaching into his coat. "I really hoped it wouldn't come to this," he said, and Eleanor realized with growing horror that he was armed. "Papa!" Sophie cried out, and Carlos immediately stopped fighting and moved to shield his daughter. The room fell silent, except for the sound of everyone's ragged breathing. Thomas Jr. smiled that cold smile again. "Now then, Mrs. Hayes, I think it's time we discussed a more permanent solution to this little problem. The only permanent solution, Eleanor said with steady courage, is the truth. Thomas Jr.'s laugh was without warmth. The truth is whatever people believe, Mrs. Hayes, and people have believed our version for nearly 80 years. But Sophie had been quietly working while the adults talked. With the quickness that only children possess, she had unscrewed the brass cylinder and was examining its contents. Her gasp drew everyone's attention. "There are pictures," she whispered. "Pictures of documents with Thomas Cromwell's name on them. And look," she held up a small photograph. "This shows him shaking hands with men in German uniforms." Thomas Jr.'s composure cracked for the first time. "Give me those documents. Now." "Sophie, run!" Carlos shouted, creating a distraction by lunging toward Thomas Jr. The 7-year-old didn't hesitate. She bolted for the door with the cylinder's contents clutched in her small hands, her father's training in emergency situations kicking in. "The stairwell!" Robert called after her. "Get to the front desk!" Eleanor found herself moving faster than she had in years, following Sophie out of the room. Behind them, they could hear the sounds of struggle and Thomas Jr. shouting orders to his son. "Call the police!" Eleanor yelled to Robert as they reached the corridor. "Call everyone!" Sophie was already halfway down the main staircase, her sneakers silent on the carpeted steps. Eleanor followed as quickly as her 79-year-old legs would carry her, adrenaline giving her strength she didn't know she still possessed. Marguerite appeared at the top of the stairs, having somehow slipped past the Cromwell men. She was speaking rapid French, and even without translation, Eleanor understood. "Hurry!" They reached the lobby, just as Sophie was spreading the photographs and documents across the front desk under the bright lights. The night clerk, a young man named Danny, stared in confusion at the elderly woman, the little girl, and the French lady who had suddenly invaded his quiet shift. "Call the police, Danny!" Eleanor gasped, still catching her breath. "These documents prove a murder." Sophie was examining the photographs with the intensity of a detective. "Look, Mrs. Eleanor, this one shows money transfers to Swiss banks, and this one—" She held up a grainy photograph. "This shows Mr. Thomas Cromwell giving papers to German soldiers." The sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs made them all look up. Thomas Jr. and his son were descending quickly but carefully. They couldn't risk causing a scene in the hotel lobby with witnesses present. "Danny," Eleanor said urgently to the desk clerk, "these men are not guests. They're threatening us. Please call security." "Mrs. Hayes," Thomas Jr. called out smoothly as he reached the lobby, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. We're here to help you with your family research, not threaten you." But Sophie had found something else in the documents that made her eyes go wide. "Papa!" she called toward the stairwell, where Carlos was now descending with Robert. "Come look at this, quick!" Thomas Jr. moved toward the front desk, but Danny had finally grasped the situation and stepped between him and the documents. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to wait while I call the manager and security," Danny said with admirable calm. Sophie was practically bouncing with excitement as Carlos reached the desk. "Papa, look at this bank record. It shows payments being made until 1987. That's way after Thomas Cromwell Sr. was supposed to be dead." Eleanor felt the world shift around her. "What did you say?" "These bank records show someone using Thomas Cromwell Sr.'s signature on financial documents dated 1985, 1986, 1987. Sophie's small finger traced down the page, but his obituary says he died in 1978. Carlos studied the documents and looked up with amazement. Either someone was forging his signature for 9 years after his death, or Thomas Cromwell Sr. didn't die in 1978, Eleanor finished. He's been alive this whole time. Thomas Jr. His face had gone ashen. His carefully maintained composure was cracking like ice in spring. "That's impossible," he said. but his voice lacked conviction. Sophie had found one more document, this one more recent than the others. Her voice was small but clear as she read, "Medical records from Sunset Manor Nursing Home. Patient, Thomas Cromwell Sr. Admitted March 15th, 2018. Current status, alive." The silence in the lobby was deafening. Eleanor looked directly at Thomas Jr., and her voice carried the authority of a woman who had finally found her truth. "Your father is alive. He's been alive this whole time, and we're going to see him." Thomas Jr. His carefully constructed world crumbled in the space between heartbeats. His son grabbed his arm, whispering urgently, "Dad, we need to leave, now." But Eleanor stepped forward with a strength that surprised everyone, including herself. "No, we're going to Sunset Manor tonight, and you're going to take us there." "Mrs. Hayes, you don't understand what you're asking," Thomas Jr. said, his voice now pleading rather than threatening. "My father, he's not the man he once was. He's 97 years old. He has dementia. He won't even remember." "He'll remember," Marguerite interrupted, in heavily accented English, speaking for the first time since the confrontation began. "Bad men always remember bad things, is written in their hearts." Sophie had been studying the medical records with the seriousness of a scholar. "It says here he has periods of lucidity, alternating with confusion. That means sometimes he remembers everything, right?" Carlos nodded, putting a protective hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Sophie's right. And if these documents are real, then Thomas Cromwell Sr. has been living a lie for 8 decades. The truth has a way of surfacing, especially near the end of life." Robert had been on the phone with hotel security, but now he hung up and turned to the group. "I've arranged for a security escort. If we're doing this, we're doing it safely." Thomas Jr. looked defeated. "You don't know what you're unleashing, my father. What he did to survive the war, what he did to protect the family business, it destroyed him. He's been haunted by it for 79 years. "Good," Eleanor said with surprising fierceness. "He should be haunted. My father died a hero. Your father stole his identity, his money, and his daughter's life. If he's haunted, then maybe there's still some conscience left in him." The drive to Sunset Manor took 40 minutes through the quiet midnight streets. Thomas Jr. rode in strained silence, occasionally giving directions to Robert, who had insisted on driving. Eleanor sat beside Marguerite, holding the French woman's weathered hand. In the back seat, Sophie dozed against her father's shoulder, the precious documents secured in a Hotel Manila envelope on her lap. Sunset Manor was an elegant facility, the kind of place where wealthy families tucked away their inconvenient elderly relatives. Thomas Jr. spoke quietly to the night supervisor, explaining they needed to see his father on urgent family business. "He's awake," the supervisor reported. "He often stays up at night. But I should warn you, he's been increasingly agitated lately, talking about the French girl and making things right. We thought it was just his dementia, but it wasn't," Eleanor said quietly. "Take us to him." Thomas Cromwell Sr. sat in a wheelchair by the window of his private room, staring out at the darkness. When they entered, he turned, and Eleanor found herself looking into eyes that held a terrible mixture of intelligence and torment. "Tommy!" he said to his son, his voice surprisingly clear. "Why are you here so late?" Then his gaze fell on Eleanor, and his entire body went rigid. "Dear God," he whispered. "Catherine? Catherine, is that you?" Eleanor stepped forward slowly. "No, Mr. Cromwell. I'm Eleanor Hayes. Catherine was my mother, and James Hayes was my father." The old man's face crumpled, and tears began streaming down his cheeks. "James," he whispered. "Oh, dear God, James. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Thomas Jr. moved toward his father. "Dad, you don't need to—" "Shut up, Tommy," the old man snapped with sudden, fierce clarity. 97 years old, and I finally get to tell the truth. Finally get to stop pretending I was the hero when I was the villain. He turned back to Eleanor, his ancient hands reaching out to her. "You look just like him, child. Just like James. He was the best man I ever knew, and I killed him. I killed him because I was a coward and a thief, and he was going to expose me." Marguerite spoke softly in French, and even though Thomas Sr. was clearly failing physically, his mind sharpened as he replied in the same language. Sophie translated, tears in her young eyes. She told him that Catherine forgave him before she died. She said Catherine prayed every night that someday he would find peace by telling the truth. Thomas Sr. nodded and switched back to English. "I have a confession to make, Eleanor Hayes. A confession I should have made 79 years ago. And I have something that belongs to you, something I've been keeping in case this day ever came." He pressed a button beside his bed, and a nurse appeared. "Margaret, please bring me the sealed envelope from my safe, the one marked for Eleanor Hayes if she ever comes." As they waited, the old man continued talking as if a dam had finally burst. "I wasn't a war hero, child. I was a war profiteer. I sold information to whoever would pay, Germans, Americans, French resistance. I didn't care about the cause, only about the money. But James found out. He had proof. He was going to turn me in when he got back to America." The nurse returned with a large sealed envelope. Thomas Sr. took it with shaking hands and gave it to Eleanor. "Your father's real will," he said simply. "The one he wrote before he died, leaving everything to Catherine and to you. I forged documents, bribed officials, created fake death certificates. I stole your inheritance and your identity." Eleanor opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was James Hayes's actual will, along with bank documents, property deeds, and a letter addressed to my daughter Eleanor should anything happen to me. "There's more," Thomas Sr. continued. "The Hayes Import Company. It's worth $47 million today. The properties, the investments, everything that should have been yours. I kept it all, lived on it, raised my family on blood money." Thomas Jr. had sunk into a chair, his head in his hands. "Dad, stop. Please stop." But his father wasn't finished. "Eleanor Hayes, I am 97 years old, and I am dying. Before I go, I want to make this right. Every penny that should have been yours, every property, every investment, it's all going back to you. My lawyer will contact you tomorrow." Eleanor looked around the room at the faces surrounding her. Marguerite, who had kept a 79-year promise. Sophie, who had unlocked the mystery with her gift for languages. Carlos and Robert, who had believed in justice. And this broken old man who was finally choosing truth over self-preservation. "Why now?" she asked Thomas Sr. "Why tell the truth now?" The old man's eyes closed, and when he opened them, they held a peace that hadn't been there before. "Because I've been dead inside for 79 years, child. And today, for the first time since 1944, I finally feel alive." The law offices of Morrison, Burke and Associates buzzed with activity as Eleanor sat in the conference room, surrounded by documents that would reshape not only her life, but the lives of everyone who had helped her uncover the truth. 3 weeks had passed since that midnight confrontation at Sunset Manor. Thomas Cromwell Sr. had died peacefully 2 days after his confession, but not before signing legal documents that transferred the entire Hayes fortune back to its rightful heir. "The total value of the estate," Attorney Patricia Morrison explained, "including accumulated interest, property appreciation, and business growth over 79 years, comes to just over $47 million. Eleanor sat quietly, still processing the magnitude of what had transpired. Beside her, Marguerite held her hand with tears of joy in her eyes. At the end of the table, Sophie colored in a new notebook while her father Carlos reviewed employment documents that would change his life forever. "Mrs. Hayes," the attorney continued, "there's also this." She handed Eleanor a leather portfolio. Mr. Cromwell Sr. spent his final years documenting everything. Every crime, every forgery, every stolen dollar. He wanted to ensure that if this day ever came, you would have complete vindication of your father's honor. Eleanor opened the portfolio to find hundreds of pages of meticulous records, including a handwritten letter from Thomas Sr. that made her eyes fill with tears. Eleanor, your father James was everything I pretended to be for 79 years. He was honorable, brave, and true. I stole his life, but I could never steal his character. You are the daughter of a hero, and I pray that someday you can forgive a dying coward who finally found the courage to do one right thing. There's more, Patricia said gently. Mr. Cromwell Jr. has agreed to cooperate fully with historical authorities to correct the public record. Your father will be posthumously recognized for his service and his sacrifice. Thomas Jr. entered the conference room at that moment, looking years older than he had 3 weeks ago. He approached Eleanor's chair hesitantly. "Mrs. Hayes," he said quietly, "I wanted to personally apologize for my family's actions. And I wanted you to know that I've established a foundation in James Hayes's name. It will help families separated by war find each other." Eleanor studied his face and saw genuine remorse. "Apology accepted, Thomas. We can't change the past, but we can make sure the future is better." Sophie looked up from her coloring. "Mrs. Eleanor, what are you going to do with all that money?" Eleanor smiled at the little girl who had made everything possible. "Well, first, I'm going to make sure a certain brilliant 7-year-old has her college education paid for, and her father is going to become the general manager of the Grand Vista Hotel." Carlos's eyes widened. "Mrs. Hayes, I couldn't possibly—" "You can and you will," Eleanor said firmly. "Robert is being promoted to regional manager, and the hotel needs someone with your integrity and observational skills." She turned to Marguerite and spoke slowly in French. She had been taking lessons. "Et vous, mon ami, will you come live with me in Boston? I'd like to learn more about my mother from someone who loved her." Marguerite's response needed no translation. Her tearful "oui" was understood by everyone. "There's one more thing," Eleanor said, reaching into her purse and pulling out the silver locket from Catherine's wooden box. "Sophie, this belongs to you now." "But it's your mama's locket," Sophie protested. "And now it's yours," Eleanor said, fastening it around the little girl's neck. "My mother would want it to belong to the brave little girl who brought truth to light. Someday, when you're older, you can pass it on to someone else who needs courage." As they prepared to leave the law office, Sophie tugged on Eleanor's sleeve. "Mrs. Eleanor, can I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetheart. Do you think your daddy knows about what happened today?" Eleanor looked out the window at the afternoon sun streaming through the clouds and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the weather. "I think he knows, Sophie. I think he finally knows that his little girl found her way home." That evening, they all gathered in the Grand Vista Hotel's dining room for what Eleanor declared would be their monthly family dinner. As they raised their glasses in a toast, Sophie stood on her chair and declared in her 7-year-old wisdom, "To families that find each other, even when it takes 79 years. As laughter filled the room, Eleanor realized that sometimes the greatest inheritances aren't money or property. Sometimes they're the truth, the connections we make, and the courage to never stop looking for where we belong. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of learning about her father's real life, his real heroism, his real legacy. But tonight, she was exactly where she was meant to be, surrounded by the unlikely family that had helped her reclaim not just her inheritance, but her identity. The mystery was solved, but the real story, the story of love, courage, and finding home, was just beginning. 6 months later, Eleanor stood in the misty morning light of Arlington National Cemetery, holding a wreath of white roses and blue forget-me-nots. Beside her, Marguerite clutched a small French flag, while Sophie held tightly to both women's hands, serving as their bridge between languages and generations. The new headstone gleamed in the soft sunlight. James Theodore Hayes, 1922-1944. Beloved son, hero, father, truth will always find its way home. Papa would have loved this, Sophie whispered, reading the inscription that she had helped choose. Carlos stood behind his daughter, now wearing the crisp suit of a hotel general manager, his pride evident in every carefully pressed line. Robert approached the small group, carrying a folder of documents. "The military ceremony is complete," he said softly. "Your father has been posthumously awarded the Bronze Star for his service and the information he tried to deliver that cost him his life." Eleanor traced her father's name with trembling fingers. 79 years, and he finally gets the recognition he deserved. Marguerite spoke in French, and Sophie translated with the wisdom that had grown even deeper over the past months. "She says Catherine is dancing in heaven today. She says your mama and papa are finally together, and they're proud of their daughter who never stopped fighting for the truth." Madi. As they stood in respectful silence, Eleanor reflected on how profoundly all their lives had changed. The James Hayes Foundation had already reunited 17 families separated by war. Carlos had transformed the Grand Vista Hotel into the most caring establishment in the city. Robert's regional promotion had led to a chain-wide program training hotel staff to assist elderly guests with family research. And Sophie, brilliant, brave Sophie, had started a special program at her school teaching other children how to help elderly people with technology and translation services. "Mrs. Eleanor," Sophie said suddenly, tugging on her coat. "Look." She pointed to a figure approaching through the morning mist. An elderly man in a military uniform walked slowly toward them, using a cane but moving with determined dignity. "Excuse me," the man said as he reached their group. "I'm Colonel William Hayes, retired, I believe." "I believe James Hayes was my uncle." Eleanor's heart stopped. "Your uncle?" "I've been searching for information about my family for years," Colonel Hayes continued. "When I saw the news stories about the Foundation and the correction of military records, I realized James was my father's brother. That would make you." "Your cousin," Eleanor whispered, and for the second time in 6 months she found herself staring into eyes that looked exactly like those in her father's photographs. Colonel Hayes studied her face with growing amazement. "Dear God, you have his eyes! And the Hayes chin! All of us have it!" He paused, emotion thick in his voice. "I have so much to tell you about our family, about your father's letters that my grandfather kept hidden for decades." Sophie bounced on her toes with excitement. "More family! Mrs. Eleanor, you have more family." As the cousins embraced for the first time, Marguerite spoke softly in French. Sophie's translation brought tears to everyone's eyes. She says this is what Catherine prayed for every night, that someday Eleanor would find not just the truth, but would find her way home to family. Colonel Hayes wiped his eyes and straightened his shoulders. "There's something else. James had a younger sister, my Aunt Marie. She's 94 years old and lives in Maine. She never married, never had children. She's been alone for 20 years, and she talks about James constantly." Eleanor felt the world expanding around her in the most wonderful way. After 79 years of believing she had no family, she was discovering relatives she'd never dreamed existed. "There's more," Colonel Hayes continued. "The family farm in Vermont, it's still in the Hayes name. James inherited it, which means it's legally yours now. It's been maintained by a trust for decades. It's waiting for you." 6 hours later, They stood on the wraparound porch of a white farmhouse nestled in the green mountains of Vermont. Aunt Marie, despite her age, had insisted on cooking dinner for everyone. Her kitchen was filled with the scent of pot roast and apple pie, and her walls were covered with photographs of James in his uniform. "I knew you'd come home someday," Marie said to Eleanor, her voice strong despite her years. "I felt it in my bones." James always said his daughter would be a fighter just like Catherine. Sophie was exploring the farmhouse with the wonder of a child discovering treasure. "Mrs. Eleanor, come see. There's a room upstairs with your daddy's things still in it." Eleanor climbed the creaky stairs to find a bedroom that looked like it had been waiting for decades. James's books, his baseball glove, even his letters to Catherine were carefully preserved in glass frames on the walls. But it was the letter on the nightstand that made her sink into the old rocking chair by the window. Marie had followed her upstairs and handed it to her with shaking hands. "He wrote this the night before he shipped out to France," Marie explained. "He asked me to give it to his daughter if she ever came home." Eleanor opened the envelope with reverent care. "My dearest Eleanor, if you're reading this, then God has answered my prayers and you've found your way to the family that has always loved you. I'm writing this not knowing if I'll ever see you or your beautiful mother again, but knowing that love is stronger than distance, stronger than war, stronger than death. You are my greatest joy and my deepest hope. Whatever life brings, remember that you are the daughter of love, love between your mother and me, love that crossed oceans and survived everything the world could throw at it. Be brave, my darling girl, be kind, be true, and know that somewhere, somehow, your papa is always watching over you. All my love, forever and always, Daddy." As Eleanor finished reading, she looked out the window at the Vermont mountains painted gold by the setting sun, and for the first time in 79 years, she felt completely, perfectly at home. Later that evening, as the unlikely family gathered around Marie's dinner table, French Marguerite, Mexican-American Carlos and Sophie, American Robert, Colonel Hayes and Marie, Eleanor stood to propose a toast. "To the truth that set us free," she said, raising her glass, "to the courage of a little girl who spoke the language of love, to the loyalty of friends who became family, and to the power of never giving up hope." Sophie, now 8 years old and wiser than her years, added her own toast. "And to proving that families aren't just born, sometimes they're found by brave people who refuse to let go of each other." As laughter and love filled the farmhouse that had waited nearly 8 decades for its daughter to come home, Eleanor realized that some stories don't end. They just begin a new chapter. And this chapter, surrounded by the family she'd found and the family who had found her, was going to be the most beautiful one yet.